IOE 413 Operating Room Scheduling Study Guide. Consider the patient's scheduling model presented in the lecture. The decision variable is defined to be x sub ij takes on the value 1 if patient I is scheduled for week j and 0 otherwise. You see the objective function for the model written down below, and this question wants you to focus on the interpretation of this term right here. It wants you to explain in words what 1 minus the sum of x sub ij from j is equal to 1 to capital J. What does that mean? Well, let's begin by considering just the sum. J is equal to 1 to capital J of x sub ij. So when we write it that way, we're thinking, okay, let's hold I fixed and sum across all j's. So what this says is when we consider just one I, that's one patient, and across all the j's, all the different weeks, this says how many times in how many different weeks is the patient scheduled for surgery. Well, if you note in the constraints, we have this constraint because, in fact, we don't want the patient scheduled multiple times. We want the patient just scheduled at most one time over the j periods, or j weeks. Well, one of the things to note then is if x sub ij is really just a binary variable taking on values of 0 or 1, when you do the summation, it can be only, this total sum here, can only be 0 or 1 because it's limited by an upper bound of 1. So this sum can only take on values 0 or 1. Well, let's go down here and consider what that means. When we have 1 minus the sum of j is equal to 1 to capital J of x sub ij, okay, and that this quantity here, the summation, is the same as the summation right here, can either take on value of 0 or 1, 0 being, okay, if the patient is not scheduled at all, or 1 if the patient is scheduled in this j week time period. Okay, so if this sum here takes on the value of 1, which means that the patient is scheduled somewhere in the week, in a time period of week 1 through capital J. Okay, if this is 1, okay, then in fact this total amount here, 1 minus 1, is 0. Okay, so this term here would take on a value of 0 if the patient was in fact scheduled during periods 1 through capital J. Well, how could this term take on a value of 1? Well, it would take on a value of 1 if this summation here was 0, and that would occur when the patient I was not scheduled for any week 1 through capital J. So this quantity here takes on a value of 1 only when the patient fails to get scheduled in the planning horizon of weeks 1 through capital J. To sum up, this question wants you to explain in words what the term 1 minus the summation x sub ij from j equals 1 to capital J means. Well, this term allows you to represent whether the patient I is scheduled for surgery in the j week planning horizon. Okay, so it's 1 if the patient doesn't get scheduled in the horizon, and 0 if it does. And that's useful because in the objective function, it allows you to penalize the situations where a patient doesn't actually get scheduled in the j week planning horizon.